Hello everyone, and welcome to World War II at 80. I'm Ron May, your host, author, historian, and speaker on World War II history and the stories of those who served. We continue with our 17th episode today, focusing on the events and stories of May 1945. The city of Berlin fell to the advancing Soviet forces on May 2nd, following 16 days of combat that resulted in the deaths of 81,000 Russians and almost 100,000 Germans. This capital city of Germany laid in ruins, with a Soviet flag planted high above it over the German Reichstag building. The Reichstag was built between 1884 and 1894. It served as the seat of parliament in the German Empire. The historic building was heavily damaged by shellfire and aerial bombs during the Battle of Berlin. The building was partially refurbished in the 1960s. After German reunification, the Bundestag decided to use the building as a seat of parliament again. Since 1994, the building has been rebuilt and renovated. Reopened in 1999, the Reichstag now functions as a seat of the federal German parliament. The once proud site of the Brandenburg Gate and the city of Berlin that stretched beyond it was in ruins at the end of World War II. Hitler promised the Reich to last for 1,000 years. His reign of terror had begun in 1933, but it crumbled 12 years later as the Allies defeated Hitler and the Nazi regime. On May 7th and 8th, headlines around the world announced the surrender of Germany and the long-awaited end to World War II in the European theater. On May 7th, German military leaders signed an unconditional surrender document with the Western Allied military heads in a ceremony that took place at a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin insisted that another surrender ceremony take place one day later in Berlin to signify the end of the war on the Eastern Front and to recognize the Soviets for their role in defeating Germany. Western Allied powers declared May 8th as Victory in Europe Day, while the Eastern powers chose May 9th as their date to celebrate the war's end in Europe. Large crowds gathered to celebrate in the United States, England, and France. Joy and relief spilled out onto the streets. The joy, however, was tempered with reminders that the war in the Pacific theater was still raging. Prime Minister Winston Churchill said during his May 8th radio broadcast to the British, quote, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, as Japan remains unsubdued," end of quote. President Truman, who was celebrating his 61st birthday on May 8th, asked that no nationwide celebration be held. He stated in his news conference, quote, "Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. If I could give you a single watchword for the coming months, that word is work, work, and more work. We must work to finish the war. Our victory is only half over," end of quote. Editorial cartoons appeared in newspapers throughout the country, conveying Truman's message that the war was not yet over. Combat in the Pacific with Japan continued. Despite the joyous news, many families found it difficult to participate in the exuberance of Germany's defeat, as they struggled to cope with the losses of sons and daughters in the war. Following Germany's surrender, the country was divided into 4 military occupation zones. The American zone was southern Germany, which included Bavaria. The British zone was in the northwest part of Germany and included the Ruhr region. The French zone was southwest Germany and included the Saarland, and the Soviet zone was most of the eastern part of Germany. The city of Berlin was also divided into 4 sectors, one controlled by each of the Allied victor nations. The purpose of the Allied occupation was threefold: to oversee the demilitarization of the German forces, to to re-educate the German public, known as denazification, and to aid in the reconstruction of the country. While many American military members, 3 million, returned home following Germany's surrender, over 1 million, those who did not have sufficient time and theater points to go home, remained in Germany as part of the occupation forces. Kermit Emerson of Liberty, Kentucky, he later moved to Mooresville, Indiana, was one of those occupation forces. He was part of the 9th Army, assigned to the 207th Field Artillery Battalion Service Supply Division. When the war ended in May, the 9th Army settled into some mop-up work, which included collecting weapons from surrendering troops of Germany's First Army. Kermit said in an interview, "They were tickled to death to meet us. They were so glad the war was finally over." John Charles Jackson of Martinsville, Indiana, served as a 105mm howitzer artilleryman with the 379th Field Artillery Battalion. "I was all over Germany," he said, and went as far south as the Austrian border. After Germany surrendered, Jackson had the opportunity to visit the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's mountain hideout in Berchtesgaden, located high in the mountains of southeastern Germany near the Austrian and Czech border. The mountain peak structure was built to honor Hitler on his 50th birthday. There was an underground elevator that took people from the parking area up to the peak where the building was located, but a sign nearby read, "For field-grade officers only." Fortunately, on the day Jackson was there, General Eisenhower was also visiting the hideout. When Eisenhower saw the sign, he removed the restriction and said that everyone could ride the elevator. "So I got to ride the elevator," said Jackson. Today, the Eagle's Nest is a popular tourist destination. Perhaps no one was happier for the end of the war in Europe than the approximate 90,000 U.S. service members who were prisoners of war in Germany. Private Charles A. Slim Smith of Morgantown, Indiana, was one of those POWs. Smith joined the Army in October 1941 and was part of the landing forces in North Africa in May 1942. He was captured by the Germans on February 17, 1943 in North Africa during the battle at Kasserine Pass. Smith spent the next 27 months as a POW at Stalag 2B Camp near Hammerstein, Pomerania, along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. The camp had a peak population close to 30,000 POWs housed from many nations, including Poland, France, Belgium, Serbia, Netherlands, Soviet Union, Italy, and America. Smith and some 500 other Americans were liberated by the advancing Russians in April 1945. Smith made it back home to Morgantown, Indiana in June of 1945. He later received the coveted Sagamore of the Wabash honor from then Indiana Lieutenant Governor Joe Kernan, himself a POW during the Vietnam conflict, at the Morgan County Veterans Memorial Program in Martinsville in November 2001. Smith wore his World War II Army uniform for the event. All service members from the European theater, those at home, and those serving occupation duty, awaited notification on whether they would be transferred to the Pacific Theater for further combat service. Meanwhile, in that Pacific Theater, the battle for Okinawa, which had begun with naval and aerial bombardment on March 26 and was followed by the Allied landings on April 1st, raged on throughout the month of May. The false sense of security that came during the unopposed landings quickly evaporated as Allied forces reached the interior of the island, where the Japanese forces were waiting for them. Combat operations turned into a slugfest, especially in southern Okinawa, as 10th Army forces engaged the majority of 76,000 Japanese soldiers and over 40,000 Okinawan conscripts, many of whom were concealed and protected by the caves throughout the region. Japanese forces fought tenaciously to defend the island fortress. Death statistics were grim on both sides of the battle. Often described as the bloodiest battle in the Pacific, and certainly the longest in duration, casualty figures reached 50,000 for Allied forces and near 100,000 for the Japanese and Okinawans. Even more tragically, close to 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the combat operations. With defeat imminent, many of the Okinawans were coerced by Japanese soldiers to commit suicide, often jumping from cliffs. This is the view from the top of one cliff that earned the moniker Suicide Cliff for the number of Okinawans who jumped to their deaths. U.S. forces did their best to assist Okinawan citizens who were hiding in caves and caught in the thick of the conflict. John Patton of Cleveland, Ohio, was serving as an air liaison officer with the 4th Joint Assault Signals Company, assigned to the 1st Marine Division. His job was to direct the bombing objectives of ground artillery, naval gunfire, and aerial bombing. On one occasion, he helped save the lives of many Marines by calling off an aerial assault. His friend and fellow air liaison officer Clifford West, shown at right, was located a few hundred yards from Patton and recounted the event that took place just 3 days after they landed. Quote, "About 6 a.m., a flight of Navy dive bombers came by and circled our position and started to strafe and bomb us. I got on the radio and tried to call them off. Navy control said they had no aircraft in the area and I must have made a wrong identification. Jack's position was a few hundred yards from mine over a small hill. He got on his radio and confirmed my ID, and soon the strike was called off. 13 Marines were killed. Later, it was determined the pilots were from a task force that had not been briefed on our position, and the pilots failed to recognize us as friendlies. Jack saved my ass." End of quote. The water was no safer for U.S. service members, as Japanese kamikazes continued their assault on Navy vessels throughout the Battle of Okinawa. David Martin of Steinsville, Indiana, witnessed the aerial attacks from the sea bordering Okinawa. Martin was a machinist mate serving on an LSM-166, that is a landing ship medium, which carried 50 troops and several tanks to shore. During one aerial attack, there was another LSM in front of Martin's ship unloading high-octane fuel when a Jap Zero dropped a bomb. "It blew her up to bits," he recalled in an interview. The only ones who survived were the ones who jumped overboard before the bomb's impact. The carnage of combat also continued on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, producing many more deaths during the month of May. On May 29th, Arnold Dutch Hacker of Martinsville, Indiana, was killed in action. He was one of the many men from Morgan County who served with Company K, 38th Division, 151st Infantry Regiment. His years of service had already earned him enough points to return home. He was waiting for his transportation orders when he was shot. Hacker was planning on getting married to his fiancée upon his return. His brother, Jarvis Hacker, too young to serve in World War II, but later served in the Korean War, recalled the moment when the news of his brother's death reached his parents. He said, "I was with my father down the road from our house helping our neighbors at a sawmill cutting lumber when the news came of Dutch's being killed in action in the Philippines. Dad, clutching the telegram, dropped to the ground in despair. Pounding on the ground in grief, Dad looked up to me and said, 'My God, Jarvie, how will I ever tell your mother?' Hacker's parents made the difficult decision to have their son permanently buried at the Manila American Cemetery on Luzon. There was thankfully also some good news regarding some Morgan County, Indiana boys serving in the Pacific Theater. Alvin L. Hastings, a staff sergeant with the Army Air Forces, experienced relief and joy as he was finally released from a Japanese POW camp in Burma. A Martinsville, Indiana native, Hastings served as a tail gunner on a bomber crew with the 7th Bombardment Group, 10th Air Force, in both India and Burma. He completed 50 missions and 200 hours in the air before he was captured. Held captive for 18 months, from December 1943 until May 1945, his parents hadn't heard from him since late 1943. In May, he and his fellow prisoners were marched by Japanese guards from their POW camp in Rangoon to what they believed would be the site of another camp. But 2 days into the forced march, their captors inexplicably left them and never returned. That night, the unguarded POWs discovered a British Army camp 2 miles away and walked into freedom. The former POWs were then flown to a hospital in Calcutta for medical treatment. Hastings returned to the United States and was discharged from the service in October 1945. There was also a remarkable engineering feat that was taking place in May 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence R. St. John, a graduate of Martinsville High School and a West Point Academy graduate, grabbed a positive headline. The May 3, 1945 Daily Reporter printed a portion of an article by Scripps Howard staff correspondent Lee Miller about the impressive road construction of St. John's 6th Engineer Battalion on Luzon. Known as the Villa Verde Trail, the twisting footpath stretched for 27 miles from Santa Maria, on the far left bottom corner of the map, to Santa Fe, on the top right part of the map, and crossed the Caraballo Mountains along the 4,800-foot high Salaxit Pass. Described in Miller's article as the Burma Road of Luzon, the road project followed the old caribou traces up from the Marikina Valley across the crazy quilt ridges and draws of the watershed, where the battle-weary 1st Division had been laboriously rooting out Japan's cave-dweller troops. The route was critical for the advance of the 6th Army, but it first had to be widened, cleared, and repaired by the 6th Engineer Battalion for military armored vehicles to pass. It was no small feat, but the 6th Engineer Combat Battalion accomplished the arduous task, and the U.S. Armored Forces moved forward in their goal of taking Luzon from the Japanese. As Memorial Day approaches, it is fitting to hear the words written by Jack Patton, the former Air Liaison Officer mentioned earlier in the video. In 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, he gave a Memorial Day speech he had written for Emmerich Manual High School in Indianapolis, where he served as an administrator. He remarked in his speech, quote, "We are prone very often to forget the great mass of people back home. The families broken apart because of young men in the service, those homes where suddenly a gold star appeared in the window, the young children who never saw their fathers, the men and women who worked the assembly lines to make the United States the arsenal of democracy. These people are just as much a part of this Memorial Day as the man in the service or in the grave on Guam or Sicily." Despite these hardships and losses, Jack also asserted in his speech that the sacrifices and suffering of those in the armed forces and those at home were worth the cost of preserving freedom. He said, quote, "This was a fight for freedom. The idea of freedom became more important to each of us as we read and heard about the atrocities of the dictators. This war was being fought not just for freedom for ourselves, but for the oppressed people of the world. From the sacrifices of millions of people on the home front and on the war fronts, there has developed a greater liberty for us all. Patton concluded his speech with the poignant image of the grave sites in the Punchbowl National Cemetery he visited while in Hawaii. He said, quote, "I realized as I looked down from the heights into the Punchbowl National Cemetery, where cross after cross in long rows represent Catholic, Jew, and Protestant, white men, black men, and yellow men all laid to rest indiscriminately, that each of them fought for what he believed was good and right, so that we, the living, might have a better place in which to live." End of quote. The crosses were later removed at the Punchbowl National Cemetery to make the grave sites non-sectarian. But the many flags beside the gravestones, especially around Memorial Day, remind us of those who died for the cause of freedom, both in our country and in many other countries of the world. I hope all of you have a meaningful Memorial Day reflection on those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom so that, in the words of Patton, we might have a better life. Learn more about World War II history during 1945 and the stories of those who served in my World War II trilogy, Our Service, Our Stories, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. The books are available for purchase on my website, ronaldpmay.com. To contact me for questions or to schedule me for a speaking engagement, email me at ron@ronaldpmay.com. Also, be sure to check out all my other videos on my YouTube channel at World War II History and Stories with Ron May. You will find a link to my videos on the YouTube tab from the homepage of my website. Please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Please share it with others who you think may be interested. See you next month for our episode 18, featuring the events and stories of June 1945 on World War II at 80.